The American grandmother of the 1960s kept her best recipes in a brown wooden box on top of the refrigerator. Index cards in pencil, margins in cursive, stains where the gravy splashed in 1962 and again in 1971. She cooked from that box every Sunday after church, and she expected her daughter to do the same. Number 23 on this list was the chicken paprikash that came over on a boat from Hungary and got translated into pencil in Cleveland in 1963. Number 18 fed a family of 9 on a single chuck roast and a sack of potatoes. Number 7 on this list is the meatloaf older women in the South still describe by smell alone. The daughters got busy. The boxes ended up at estate sales. Hit subscribe and let's open the recipe box, because here are 60 forgotten heirloom suppers from the 1960s no one passes down anymore. Number 21, creamed chipped beef on toast. The military gave it a name that cannot be printed here. Mothers kept it clean. Thin slices of dried beef, salt-cured and almost leathery, torn into strips and dropped into a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, poured over thick slices of white toast. That was supper. In working-class neighborhoods across Ohio and Pennsylvania, and in mill towns from the Piedmont to the Monongahela Valley, this was a weeknight staple from the 1940s all the way through the 1960s. A jar of dried beef cost 35 cents in 1965. It fed 4 people over toast. The roux had to be stirred constantly or it scorched, which is why every woman who made it stood at the stove the whole time. There were no shortcuts. The white sauce either came together smooth or it didn't. Most mothers could tell by the smell when it was right. They didn't use a timer, they just knew. That is a kind of skill you can't buy. Fried cabbage cost almost nothing. A full head fed a family of 5, and the only other ingredient was salt pork, which was the cheapest cut at the smokehouse or the company store. You shredded the cabbage coarse, got the skillet hot, laid the salt pork in until it colored, then added the cabbage all at once and covered the pan long enough for steam to wilt it. Then you took the lid off and let the water cook out until the edges browned at the bottom of the pan. The pinch of sugar was the secret. Not enough to taste sweet, just enough to pull the natural sugars out of the cabbage and help it caramelize, and the women who knew this never needed to say it out loud because they had learned it by watching. In Depression-era Appalachia, cabbage was one of the few vegetables that grew cheap and reliable in Rocky Mountain soil, and fried cabbage with side meat appeared on supper tables across West Virginia and Virginia coal country 3 and 4 nights a week without anyone considering it hardship. It tasted like something made with care. It was. If Welsh rarebit was toast dressed up, eggs goldenrod was toast in its Sunday best. Simple enough for a child to eat and pretty enough that your mother took a quiet pride in serving it. She hard-boiled the eggs, separated the whites from the yolks, chopped the whites into small pieces, and folded them into a white sauce she made in the same pan she used for everything. That creamy mixture went over buttered toast, and then, the part that gave the dish its name, she pressed the bright yellow yolks through a sieve so they fell like golden dust over the top. The dish was named for the goldenrod wildflower, and in certain Catholic households through the 1950s and 60s, it showed up nearly every Friday when meat was off the table. It cost almost nothing. It fed the whole family. And the woman who made yours probably learned it from her own mother, who learned it from hers, none of them ever writing it down because there was nothing to write. You just knew. Methodist meat pie was the practical answer to feeding large crowds economically, stretching small amounts of ground beef into hearty slices that satisfied working families. Church women would brown inexpensive ground beef with onions and simple seasonings, then spread the mixture into large sheet pans lined with homemade biscuit dough. A second layer of dough covered the top before baking until golden, creating individual portions that could be served without plates or forks if necessary. The beauty was in the portability. Men could eat standing in fellowship halls between services. Children could carry portions outside without messes. Each church had its own variations, some adding canned tomatoes for moisture, others folding in leftover vegetables. The pies appeared at Wednesday night suppers, funeral receptions, and building fund dinners where economy mattered more than elegance. A little meat, some flour, and willing hands transformed church basements into places where no one left hungry. Barley and beef hot dish was not just dinner, it was survival food disguised as comfort. You would take ground beef, brown it with onion, and stir in pearl barley, diced tomatoes, maybe some frozen corn or green beans if you had them. Everything went into a casserole dish and baked until the barley softened and soaked up every last drop of flavor. This was a meal that stretched far, filled deep, and cost almost nothing to make. It was a regular fixture in Midwest and Prairie church cookbooks, where hot dish meant any warm, baked, one-pan meal that could carry a family through the week. Barley was one of those ingredients that folks kept on hand even if they did not cook with it often. It lasted forever and went with just about anything. When meat was scarce or expensive, barley helped bulk things out without feeling like a compromise. The beef was there for flavor, the barley for weight, and the vegetables for whatever nutrition you could scrape together. This dish fed church families, volunteer teams, and tired mothers who just needed one night off from thinking about supper. It was humble food, but it held people together. Creamed chipped ham on biscuits was the unofficial supper of Pittsburgh, and it had a way of spreading from city kitchens to country church cookbooks. It was made by chopping thin slices of deli ham, usually chipped or shredded, then simmering them in a white sauce of milk, butter, and flour. The sauce was ladled over fresh biscuits, toast, or even saltines depending on what was around. It was salty, creamy, and stuck to your ribs in the best possible way. This meal started as a working-class favorite, especially in mill towns and coal country, but it worked its way into church kitchens too. It was cheap, it was easy to scale up, and it made use of inexpensive lunch meat that could be bought by the pound. During busy weeks with lots of evening programs or youth nights, it was the kind of meal that filled a crock pot and waited patiently until everyone was done rehearsing or cleaning pews. Church ladies appreciated how little it cost and how much it satisfied. It was also one of those dishes that made leftovers feel like something special, especially when paired with sweet pickles or stewed apples on the side. Quiche Lorraine somehow found its way from French cafes to American kitchens and never looked back. Made with eggs, cream, bacon, and Swiss cheese baked into a pie crust, it was the closest most families got to elegance on a weekday. It showed up at brunches, baby showers, and dinner tables alike, equal parts savory pie and silky casserole. The bacon brought salt, the cheese brought richness, and the cream made it smooth enough to spoon. This was a dish that made leftovers feel fancy. Leftover crust? Use it. Bits of bacon? Toss them in. Quiche Lorraine was forgiving and flexible, but it always looked like you tried. That was the secret. It felt refined without being complicated. Your mother could make it while balancing a phone call and homework help. It slid onto the table golden and steaming, and everyone got a slice. No fuss. Just quiet satisfaction. In the 1980s, it became shorthand for sophistication on a budget. It may have started in Paris, but by then, it lived in Pyrex. Tripe and onion casserole was this slow-cooked dish that people made with beef tripe, which was the stomach lining of a cow. I know we've had some really bad casseroles on the list so far, and I genuinely am sorry for exposing you to the evils of our nation. Tripe and onion casserole was really just this slow-cooked dish that incorporated beef tripe with a vegetable butter-based broth. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what tripe is, it's the stomach lining of a cow. As you can probably guess, most of the items on the list are organ meat recipes, and they fell off badly. I've never seen something have a downfall like this. Tripe was readily available, it was practical and inexpensive, and it was also tender. This was one of the few things on the list that didn't have an immediately offensive texture, so there is always that. It still couldn't last in the long run, though, because tripe simply had too much of an aroma that I can only best describe as the scent you would associate with a barnyard. On top of that, the gelatinous texture wasn't something people were down for, and most people would instead just go for normal or better cuts of meat and ration those out according to their budget, rather than bother with recipes like this that just made them feel bad after eating. Number 28. Mashed rutabagas. Rutabaga was the route that fed Vermont and Minnesota and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan when carrots ran out. A mother peeled the waxy yellow skin with a paring knife, cut the flesh into chunks, boiled it soft, and mashed it with butter and salt. Some households added a little brown sugar, some added a splash of cream. The flavor was earthier than potato, sweeter than turnip, and it sat on a Tuesday plate next to a pork roast for under 20 cents a serving. Grocery stores in Duluth and Burlington stocked rutabagas in bushel baskets through winter. The vegetable was cheap because nobody under 40 wanted it, and cheap was the point. Mashed rutabagas were the side dish the cold months made necessary. Number 22. Killed lettuce and onions. Pulling tender leaf lettuce from the garden in the cool of morning was the first chore. Greens were washed in a tin pan, torn rough into a wooden bowl. A handful of green onions on top, sliced thin, the white parts kept separate from the green for the look of the bowl. Then the bacon grease, scalding hot from the skillet, poured straight over the leaves. They hissed and sank under the heat. A little vinegar, a touch of brown sugar, a small shake of pepper, and the bowl went out warm with the bacon strips laid across the top. Leftover dressing was poured back over the leaves twice during the meal so the lettuce stayed slick. The bowl was usually empty before anyone reached for second cornbread. Number 20. Pork chop and rice bake. This was the supper that cooked itself in 40 minutes while she sat down for the first time since breakfast. Lay 4 thin-cut pork chops in a deep skillet. Pour a cup of dry, long-grain rice around them. Pour 2 cups of water over the top. Add a sliced onion, a sprinkle of salt, a few peppercorns. Lid on. Lowest flame on the back burner. Walk away. Grandmothers in Iowa and Indiana set the timer, sat down in the kitchen chair with the bent leg, and rested their feet for half an hour before they had to set the table. The rice drank up the pork juices and went tender. The chops finished bone loose. 1 pan to wash, no oven heat, no second pot. A whole supper for a family of 5 at the cost of 4 chops and a cup of rice. Number 16. Funeral potatoes. Frozen hash browns. A can of cream of chicken soup. Crushed cornflakes on top. Baked until the cornflakes turned golden and the potatoes underneath melted into something warm and filling and impossibly comforting. The Relief Society of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints made this dish so often for grieving families that it earned its name from the occasion. By the 1950s, funeral potatoes had spread beyond Utah and Idaho into Methodist and Baptist churches across the Great Plains. A bag of frozen hash browns cost 39 cents in 1960. A can of soup cost 15 cents. A box of cornflakes cost a quarter. You could comfort an entire bereaved family for under 80 cents. That was the economics of grief in mid-century America. You could not fix the loss. You could not fill the empty chair. But you could fill the table, and for one evening, surrounded by the smell of something warm and familiar, that had to be enough. The dish earned its name honestly. Number 18. Potato and onion skillet hash. 4 potatoes, 1 onion, bacon grease in the bottom of a cast iron skillet. Your mother sliced the potatoes thin so they cooked fast, laid them flat in the hot grease and pressed them down with a spatula, then left them alone long enough to brown before she turned them. The onions went in halfway through, softening and turning sweet against the crust that had formed on the potatoes. Salt, pepper. That was all it needed. 1 pan, 1 flame. Under a dime. Under a dime. Nothing wasted. In rural communities across Tennessee and Kentucky, fried potatoes and onions was the supper that appeared when there was nothing in the house but the potato sack and the onion bin. A pound of potatoes cost about 5 cents in 1964. The skillet was ready in 20 minutes. Everyone ate until the pan was clean. No stove required beyond a flame and patience. No pots to wash but 1. The first frost came fast in the mountains and killed whatever was still green overnight. Fried green tomatoes were what you made the week before. Every tomato that hadn't ripened, sliced thick, dredged through cornmeal with salt and pepper, and laid into a skillet of hot bacon grease until the outside went golden and crackled and the inside softened just enough to give. They weren't the romanticized version that arrived in restaurants decades later. They were a practical harvest, a way of eating what would otherwise rot on the vine. The cornmeal crust transformed the chalky bitterness of an unripe tomato into something with texture and heat, and enough fat to feel like a meal. Mountain families in North Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee had done this since the 19th century, using cornmeal ground at the nearest mill. You never added anything fancy to the dredge. The grease had to be hot enough that the slice sizzled the second it touched the pan. If it didn't, you'd waited too long. If you had to ask how hot the grease was, you weren't ready to cook them. If scalloped corn was built for crowds, stuffed green peppers were built for the family table. Each one a small, self-contained meal packed tight and simmered until the pepper walls went soft enough to cut with a fork. Your mother hollowed out the peppers, mixed ground beef with cooked rice and a beaten egg, packed the filling in firm, and set them upright in a deep pot with canned stewed tomatoes poured around the base. The lid went on and the pot simmered for what felt like hours, the kitchen filling with a sweet, beefy steam that clung to the curtains. By the 1960s, stuffed peppers appeared in nearly every women's magazine and community cookbook in America, each version slightly different. Some added Worcestershire sauce, others a handful of shredded cheese on top in the last 5 minutes. The dish required patience more than skill, and the mothers who made it best were the ones who never rushed the simmer. One Quora commenter, remembering the era, wrote simply that her mother simmered them for hours in stewed tomatoes, and that she no longer makes them since her father passed away. Crackling bread was the cornbread that announced hog-killing season at rural churches, made with crispy pork skin bits folded into the batter. When families butchered their yearly hogs, the fat was rendered into lard, leaving behind brown, crunchy cracklings too flavorful to discard. Churchwomen mixed these directly into cornmeal batter, creating bread that was simultaneously crispy, chewy, and intensely savory, with each bite containing surprises of pork richness. The bread was baked in cast-iron skillets, preheated with lard until smoking, developing a crust that shattered between teeth before giving way to tender interior. At church suppers, following community hog killings, crackling bread appeared alongside beans, greens, and every part of the pig transformed into supper. What made this bread special was its connection to self-sufficiency and the satisfaction of using everything the animal provided. The smell of crackling bread baking meant winter was coming, and the community had prepared together. Teriyaki chicken with minute rice was weeknight takeout without the takeout bag. Soy sauce, brown sugar, garlic, and pineapple juice turned simple chicken into a sticky sweet masterpiece. It was cooked in a skillet or electric wok, poured over hot, fluffy minute rice, and eaten straight from the plate while steam curled into the kitchen light. It felt exotic back then, sweet, salty, and just a little tangy. Teriyaki was not yet everywhere, so having it at home felt like a treat. Bottled marinades were popular, but homemade versions became kitchen staples too. Families made it with chicken breasts or thighs, depending on what was in the freezer. Pineapple chunks were often tossed in for extra sweetness. It was not just fast, it was festive. You got a colorful plate, an easy cleanup, and a dinner that actually made you smile. It looked glossy, smelled amazing, and made your weeknight feel a little more like a celebration. Teriyaki chicken with minute rice was fusion without realizing it. It gave American families a taste of something new, dressed up in ingredients they already knew how to use. It was sweet, it was easy, and it was too good to forget. Cornmeal dumplings over stewed tomatoes were the kind of meatless meal that still filled you up and stuck to your bones. You would make the stewed tomatoes first, fresh or canned, simmered down with onion, sugar, and maybe a splash of vinegar for balance. Then you would drop spoonfuls of a cornmeal batter right on top, cover the pot, and let the steam puff them up like little yellow clouds. This was Depression-era food, no doubt about it, but it carried on through the 1940s and 1950s in Southern church kitchens. It was warm, bright, and comforting in a strange way. The cornmeal dumplings were cheap to make and stretched the tomatoes into something hearty enough to count as supper. Church ladies brought it to meatless Monday dinners or served it at home when payday was still a few days off. You would not find steak in a dish like this, but you would find a kind of quiet resilience. Even when cupboards were nearly bare, meals like this proved you could still sit down and feel taken care of. You just needed cornmeal, tomatoes, and a little bit of hope. Meatloaf with ketchup glaze was the definition of classic comfort, a slab of ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and egg, then topped with a thick, sweet glaze of ketchup and brown sugar. It sat in a loaf pan, sizzling as the glaze caramelized in the oven, sending out smells that filled every corner of the house. It was never flashy, but it never needed to be. This was the kind of supper that could stretch a pound of ground beef into a meal for 6. Every slice was the same, moist, tender, and sticky on top. Some families added Worcestershire or mustard, others swore by keeping it simple. Either way, it was a permanent fixture of the 1980s dinner table. It was dependable, it was nostalgic, and it somehow got better the next day in a sandwich with a slice of white bread. Parents loved it because it was easy. Kids loved it because the glaze was basically candy. And even picky eaters found something to like. In an age of frozen meals and fast food, this was a hot meal that said someone still had time to care. Honestly, I think oyster and prune stew is one of the least offensive ones here. It's an unusual combination, that's for sure, but that doesn't make it as much of a menace to society and culture as liver and banana casserole. This had briny, salty oysters mixed in with really sweet and stewed prunes. I can imagine what the idea was and what kind of vibe they were going for, but I think the execution failed the dish. The dish was really trying to take after some European-influenced cuisine, as you can probably tell by the fact that the broth was made with cream, butter, and usually French wine. Oysters were really cheap back in the 1800s and even in the early 20th century, and they were a staple meal for coastal communities like we talked about. Prunes were also something people genuinely loved and paired with meats often enough. European cuisine was slowly taking over American kitchens as more and more people wanted to experiment and try it out for themselves. The pieces were all set. You just had to put it in motion, but once people did, they realized this wasn't actually that good of a combination. It clashed too much with the sweetness of the prunes instead of contrasting it. Plus, overfishing meant oysters were generally being consumed less thanks to pressure from governments and environmental groups. Prunes had a fine reputation, but they were a side to steaks and stuff. Again, we have an aspic dish, and by this point, you might be able to piece together that people really went overboard with them. By that I mean too much experimentation is also a bad thing. Number 27, buttered lima beans. The smell of butter melting in a saucepan over a low flame was the start of 1,000 weeknight dinners. A box of bird's eye baby limas went in frozen, half a stick of butter, a teaspoon of salt, a grind of pepper. 10 minutes later, the limas were on the plate next to fish sticks or sliced ham, glossy and pale green and soft. Children who hated lima beans at school would eat them at home because their mother had not boiled them into gray paste. The trick was butter and not too much water. Bird's Eye sold the boxes from the freezer case of every A&P and Kroger and Safeway, and a mother could buy 3 for 45 cents. Buttered limas were the side frozen food made easy. Number 24, tomato gravy on toast. Canned tomatoes were her own from August of 1967, 50-quart jars stacked in the cellar 2 shelves high, sealed with paraffin and a metal ring. By February, the green beans were gone and the corn was gone, and you reached for what was left. Your grandmother heated a pint jar in a saucepan with bacon grease, a spoon of flour, pepper, and a touch of brown sugar, and ladled it over toast. Breakfast for your 5 aunts and uncles, served with a pitcher of cold milk. The whole pan ran under 15 cents. They ate it because they had to. And the tomato gravy itself was an old Depression-era trick, the way you turned the last jar of summer into a hot Sunday breakfast in February. 40 years later, those same children ordered it from waitresses in Tennessee diners and called it the closest thing to home on the menu. Number 26, salmon patties. A can of pink salmon sat on the shelf at Piggly Wiggly for under 30 cents through most of the 1950s, and Southern grandmothers bought 2 at a time. Open the can, lift out the bones if you cared to, mash the rest right into a bowl with 1 egg and a sleeve of crushed saltines. Patty them up with your hands. Heat a slick of bacon grease in her seasoned pan until it shimmered. Drop the patties in, 4 at a time, and they crisped golden on each side in about 3 minutes. Grandmothers in Alabama and Tennessee served them with a wedge of lemon and whatever was left in the pickle jar. The whole supper came together in the time it took the cornbread to bake. Some women added a spoonful of cornmeal to the mix for crunch. Some used flour. The pan never went into the dishpan because nothing went in it but salmon. Number 23, Depression casserole. Ground beef, canned corn, sliced potatoes, layered in a baking dish and cooked until the potatoes softened and the beef fat soaked into every layer. This recipe had no name in 1934. Women just called it supper. It appeared in church cookbooks across the Midwest with slight variations but always the same bones. Meat on the bottom, starch on top, a vegetable somewhere in between. A pound of ground beef cost 12 cents during the Depression. A can of corn cost a nickel. The potatoes came from the garden. The whole dish fed a family of 6 for under 20 cents. By the 1950s, Baptist churches in Tennessee and Georgia were serving this at homecoming dinners, feeding 60 people from a dozen casserole pans lined up on folding tables covered with paper tablecloths. Nobody photographed it. Nobody wrote about it. If you grew up in the rural South, you knew this dish. It showed up because that was what those women did. Number 23, dried corn soup. After the last ears of summer corn came off the stalks, women across the hill country of Pennsylvania and West Virginia cut the kernels thin and laid them out to dry on old window screens set in the sun. By October, the kernels had shriveled to hard, pale chips with a concentrated sweetness that fresh corn never had. Come November, a handful went into a pot of water with a piece of side meat, an onion, and nothing else. The pot simmered all afternoon while your grandmother worked at something else. By supper, the dried kernels had swollen back up and turned the broth milky and thick. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, among Mennonite and Pennsylvania Dutch families, this was called dried corn soup, and it appeared every winter without fail. The flavor was not like canned corn. It was deeper, almost nutty, the way something tastes when summer has been cooked down to its most honest form. 1 pot. No stove skill required beyond patience. The women who made it were alive to the fact that summer did not last. They made it last anyway. Nobody called them hoe cakes because they were fashionable. They got the name because early Appalachian settlers sometimes cooked them on the flat of a hoe blade held over an open fire when no skillet was available, a technique documented in the Foxfire series of oral histories from the 1970s. By the time these kitchens were at their peak, hoe cakes were made in cast iron with no ceremony. Cornmeal, a pinch of salt, enough water for a pourable batter, dropped onto a hot greased skillet in silver dollar rounds and cooked until the edges went lacy. They were done in under 10 minutes. No oven, no yeast, no waiting. You could make them while the beans simmered and have bread on the table before the pot was ready. Some cooks added an egg. Most didn't. They used what they had, which was cornmeal and bacon grease in a hot pan. Younger generations grew up thinking cornbread always came from a box and always baked in the oven. So the knowledge of making bread on a stovetop with nothing but cornmeal and heat slipped away quietly, without anyone choosing to let it go. The sound of canned salmon patties hitting a skillet of hot butter, that sizzle, that pop of moisture against fat, was one of those kitchen sounds you never forget. A steady, crackling hiss that meant supper was 10 minutes away. Your mother cracked open a tall can of pink salmon, picked through it with a fork to pull out the skin, and mashed the soft bones right in because she said they were good for you, full of calcium. She mixed in a beaten egg, crushed saltine crackers, a squeeze of lemon if there was one, and shaped the patties by hand. Never too thick, never too thin. They fried golden in the skillet, crispy on the outside and soft in the center. And you ate them with ketchup if you were a kid or tartar sauce if you were trying to act grown. The whole meal, salmon patties, canned corn, and instant mashed potatoes, ran about 60 cents in 1963. Every mother had her own ratio of cracker to salmon, and if you asked her how much, she would just say enough. Sawmill gravy with cathead biscuits was the working-class breakfast that fueled Sunday mornings before church across the Appalachian South. The gravy earned its name from lumber camps where cooks stretched meat drippings into filling meals for hungry workers, using flour and milk to create thick white sauce flecked with bits of sausage or bacon. Cathead biscuits, so called because they were large as a cat's head, were dropped onto baking sheets without rolling, resulting in irregular shapes with crusty tops and soft interiors, perfect for soaking up gravy. Church kitchens adopted this combination for fellowship breakfasts, with women arriving before dawn to mix biscuit dough and heat cast-iron skillets. The smell of frying sausage and browning flour drew families from parking lots into basement dining rooms where long tables waited. Men would pile their plates high, knowing the gravy would carry them through 3-hour services. This was food that honored labor and simplicity. Sardine whips were a dish that had the texture of a mousse but the taste of canned sardines. Whipped cream, gelatin, and cream cheese can work wonders in terms of texture, but when you throw something like sardines in there, you just ruin the whole thing. The mixture was also whipped to the moon and back until it was as light as a cloud. So, in terms of preparation, I think people did whatever they could to make this appetizing. Unfortunately, nothing can mask the stage-stealing taste of sardines, and I do not use that term in a good way. The fishy taste was way too overpowering for a lot of people, especially Americans who had grown up in the South or in places that did not have any fishing or seafood culture. What seafood people did like was typically grilled, roasted, or just fried. Gelatin-heavy party foods were also falling out of fashion, and those were just too many nails for this recipe's coffin. Cheesy spinach squares were what you made when you wanted to sneak something green into a potluck plate without getting too many complaints. You would mix chopped spinach, frozen or fresh, with eggs, shredded cheddar cheese, and a little flour and baking powder to bind it all together. Then it was poured into a baking dish, cooked until firm, and sliced into neat little squares. They were good warm or cold, which made them perfect for women's circles, bridal showers, and youth group meetings where you could not count on an oven being available. The flavor was mild but rich, and the texture fell somewhere between a quiche and a savory brownie. These squares were especially loved by the women who brought them because they were just so easy. No crust, no fuss, just a big mixing bowl and a square pan. They showed up in dozens of church cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, often with hand-scribbled notes in the margin like "add nutmeg" or "great with hot sauce." You might not think of spinach as a crowd pleaser, but when it came baked with cheese and egg into a tidy little square, it sure had a way of disappearing fast. Chicken cordon bleu casserole was the shortcut supper that turned a fancy French dish into a creamy, weeknight-friendly bake. You started with chopped chicken, leftover or canned. Add in cubed ham, a few slices of Swiss cheese, and a rich sauce made from sour cream or cream of chicken soup. It all went into a casserole dish and got baked until bubbly and golden on top. No stuffing, no rolling, just the flavors of chicken cordon bleu without the effort. This dish felt grown up, but it was easy enough for anyone to make. It tasted like something from a restaurant, even if it came from a bag of shredded cheese and a can of soup. It was a go-to for potlucks, holiday leftovers, or a random Tuesday night when you wanted something cozy but a little bit elevated. If your mother ever made it, you remember how the ham melted into the sauce and how the Swiss gave it that sharp edge that kept you coming back. Spam and lima bean casserole is every bit the atrocity it sounds, and it's one of the worst things we've ever done as a country with Spam. A salty and processed pork product that was supposed to make life a lot more convenient for everyone wasn't supposed to be used like this, and I'm glad we can agree with that. Mostly. The middle of the 20th century was a scary time because it was wrought with economic strife. Your neighbor could genuinely ruin your entire week with one of these, especially because this was supposed to be a budget-friendly meal for families. Lima beans, cream sauce, and breadcrumbs or cheese. Who could possibly think that was a good idea? Spam just used to be so available that people were making anything, and the middle of the 20th century was also a time when casseroles were slowly reviving and fusion food was slowly beginning to take off too. But this isn't the direction you go in, and I'm glad people left this in the last century. It's still not as bad as the next one, though. Number 20, corn pudding. Egg and cream did the binding work, and a can of cream-style corn did everything else. A mother in a Virginia Tidewater kitchen or a Kentucky bluegrass farmhouse would beat 3 eggs in a Pyrex bowl, stir in evaporated milk, a tablespoon of flour, a tablespoon of sugar, salt and pepper, and a 15-ounce can of Del Monte cream-style corn. The mixture went into a buttered baking dish and into a 350 oven for 50 minutes. The pudding came out custardy in the middle, golden brown at the edges, sweet and soft and savory all at once. It sat on the Sunday table next to a country ham. It was a side dish, but a child would eat it like dessert. Corn pudding was the side dish that a Sunday oven made worth the wait. Number 29, ham hock and pinto beans. The smell of hog and onion came up through the floorboards by 10 in the morning, and the rest of the holler stayed quiet until that smell drifted out the back door. A smoked hock from the fall hog had been wrapped in cloth and kept in the spring house, shaved off a piece every Sunday for the bean pot. Most years, the hock had not been bought from the meat counter at all, since the hog had come up from the barnyard the previous November. Beans cooked low for 3 quiet hours until the meat slid loose from the bone. The whole pot went out with a slice of pone and a tall glass of buttermilk. The same hock and bean pot had simmered on Buchanan County stoves through 3 coal strikes between 1949 and 1965, the recipe never written down once. Those who ate it as kids are 60 now. They still salt their cornbread the way she did. Number 29, American chop suey. New England kitchens borrowed the name from a Chinese restaurant idea and turned it into the cheapest weeknight supper a tired woman could put on a table. The first printed recipe ran in the Alton Evening Telegraph in Illinois in August of 1910, with ground beef, a can of tomatoes, an onion, and macaroni. By the 1950s, Milltown wives in Massachusetts and Rhode Island were cooking it on Friday paydays when the meat budget was already spent. 1 pound of Hamburg browned in her seasoned pan. A chopped onion went in next, then a can of tomato sauce and a box of elbows that cooked right in the same pot. 40 minutes from coat hook to table. The leftovers went into a lunch pail wrapped in waxed paper, and nobody complained because nobody had anywhere else to be. Number 19, peach cobbler. 1 cup of self-rising flour, 1 cup of sugar, 1 can of sliced peaches with the syrup. Mixed together, poured into a greased pan, and baked at 350 until the top turned golden and the fruit bubbled through the crust like lava. This was the cuppa recipe that every Southern grandmother knew by heart. A cup of this, a cup of that, a cup of the other thing. No measuring spoons, no thermometer, no second guessing. The recipe appeared in church cookbooks from Texas to the Carolinas, starting in the 1940s and never left. A can of peaches cost 19 cents in 1955. The flour and sugar were pantry staples that every kitchen already had. Dessert for 12 people cost less than a quarter, and the woman who brought it to church walked through that fellowship hall door like she was carrying gold. Because she was. Number 16, hamburger gravy over rice. A 1/4 pound of ground beef, browned in the skillet with a diced onion until it broke into crumbles. A spoonful of flour stirred in to make a roux with the drippings. Beef broth or water added slowly, stirred until a thin brown gravy formed around the meat. Poured over white rice that had been cooked while the gravy came together. In the farming communities of the Mississippi Delta and the rural counties of Arkansas, this was called hamburger gravy, and it was understood that 1/4 pound of meat could feed a family of 5 over rice without anyone walking away hungry. Ground beef cost 49 cents a pound in 1965. A cup of dry rice cost less than a dime. 4 people full for under 30 cents a serving. There is no restaurant in America that has figured out how to charge for that ratio. There never will be. The math doesn't work in their favor. Bulldog gravy was what you made when there was no meat at all, also called white gravy or milk gravy or just gravy with no qualifier. It started with whatever fat you had, a heaping spoon of flour stirred in until the roux thickened, and then milk or water poured in slow. In Appalachia, The version made with water instead of milk was sometimes called poor gravy, even by the people who ate it, because they knew the difference and they felt it. You poured it over day-old cornbread that had gone dry, and the gravy brought it back to something that could fill a stomach. In Kentucky and West Virginia, mining communities during the Depression, and again during the coal slowdowns of the 1950s and 60s, this was what supper looked like on the worst weeks of the month. Not a figure of speech, just the actual food on the actual table. The children who ate it grew up and moved to cities and never made it again, and some never told their own kids it had existed. It was not chicken, and it never had been. City chicken was cubes of pork and veal threaded onto wooden skewers, breaded, browned in a skillet, and baked slow until the meat went tender enough to pull apart with a fork. The dish came out of Polish and Ukrainian neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit during the Depression, when chicken was a luxury that only farm families could afford and pork scraps were cheap at the butcher counter. By the 1960s, actual chicken had become affordable, but city chicken had already earned its place on the weekly rotation in Great Lakes households. Mothers kept making it because their mothers had made it, and the taste was nothing like real poultry anyway. It was richer, fattier, and the breading held a brown gravy that you spooned over mashed potatoes until the plate was swimming. Butcher shops in Pittsburgh still sold the pre-skewered meat in wax paper packages through the 70s. If you grew up east of the Mississippi and never heard of it, that is exactly the point. This was a dish that belonged to the families who made it and nobody else. Poke salad with bacon was the springtime dish that appeared on church tables when families emerged hungry from winter's preserved foods and craved fresh greens. Pokeweed grew wild throughout the South, sending up tender shoots each March that provided the first edible greens of the season before gardens produced anything. The preparation required knowledge passed through generations. Young poke leaves had to be boiled in multiple changes of water to remove toxins that made mature plants dangerous. Churchwomen who understood these techniques gathered poke together, processing large batches for community meals. The cooked greens were then fried with bacon drippings and crumbled bacon until wilted and richly flavored. Served alongside cornbread, poke salad delivered vitamins and minerals that winter-weary bodies desperately needed while connecting congregations to foraging traditions. This was survival knowledge disguised as supper, reminding people that nature provided abundance for those who understood where to look. Ground bologna salad sandwiches were one of those chilled, spreadable creations that popped up on church supper tables more often than you would think. You would take a chunk of bologna, usually the cheap kind, run it through a meat grinder or chop it fine, then mix it with mayo, chopped pickles, and a bit of hard-boiled egg. Sometimes a spoonful of relish or mustard got added for tang, and sometimes not. The result was a creamy, meaty spread perfect for sandwich bread, saltines, or celery sticks. It was not elegant, but it was dependable. Church ladies loved it because it could be made in advance and kept cold until needed. It showed up at funeral receptions, youth nights, and sandwich socials where the goal was to feed many and spend little. Kids liked it for the mild flavor. Grown-ups liked it because it reminded them of simpler times. You would find this recipe handwritten in the margins of old cookbooks, sometimes labeled bologna spread or sandwich filler. It was humble, a little strange, and deeply familiar if you grew up around it. Just one bite and it came right back. Mock chicken legs, often called city chicken, were one of the more creative illusions that came out of old church kitchens. You would take cubes of pork or veal, thread them onto wooden skewers, bread them like fried chicken, and then either fry or bake them. They had nothing to do with chicken except for the fact that they kind of looked like a drumstick when you picked one up. This dish became a hit in the Rust Belt during the 1930s and 1940s when chicken was actually more expensive than pork. Polish and Slovak communities took to it quickly, and so did the churches they were part of. You would find the recipe in all kinds of regional cookbooks from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. These were especially common at church picnics, potlucks, and summer weddings where trays of chicken legs would come out hot and crispy. Some cooks dipped them in gravy, others just served them plain with mashed potatoes and green beans. They were easy to make in big batches and tasted even better the next day. Church ladies loved that. It was thrifty, It was fun, and it made folks smile when they realized the chicken was not chicken at all. Beef stroganoff took a hard left turn in the 1980s, and nobody was mad about it. The hamburger helper version was the most famous, but even homemade versions started borrowing from that quick and easy formula. Instead of strips of steak, you had ground beef. Instead of slow simmering, you had a one-pan, 15-minute meal. The creamy sauce, made from sour cream and mushroom soup or packet mixes, was poured over wide egg noodles and stirred until it looked just right. Thick, glossy, and beige in that oddly comforting way. It did not pretend to be authentic. It just wanted to get dinner on the table. This was a working parent's dream. Minimal prep, affordable ingredients, and flavor that punched way above its weight. Kids loved it. Adults loved it. Even picky eaters could get behind those silky noodles coated in savory cream. If you grew up in the 1980s, this was the taste of a weeknight. The clink of forks on Corelle plates, the hum of a kitchen lit by a single overhead bulb. It was warm, familiar, and deeply satisfying. If you boiled cabbage in milk, you either were pretty bad at judging what a dish would end up tasting like, or you just had a fondness for experimenting. Cabbage and milk stew was this incredibly simple dish that you would make with butter, salt, and a bit of flour for thickening, but it was just that. Simple. Delicious? Good? Palatable? None of those things. The entire idea of this was that it was cheap, healthy, and took no effort or ingredients to make, which meant that it was something that was most popular in rough times. We talk a lot about the resilience of American people through the Depression, but we don't talk enough about how glad they were to leave meals like this behind once their situations improved. Nobody liked the thought of cabbage and milk stew after a long, hard day working and laboring or taking care of the kids and managing the house. The textures were really bad. Boiling cabbage meant that it would release a really pungent aroma. The texture of this was soggy, the taste was sour and bland, and there were just better ways of being healthy if that was your thing, especially with the advent of canning things. Number 22. Glazed carrots. Brown sugar melted into butter in a saucepan and coated a pound of sliced carrots until they shone. The mother who made glazed carrots on a Wednesday night had probably watched her own mother do the same in 1942. Boil the carrots first, drain them, return them to the pan with the butter and sugar, swirl until the glaze thickens. Some households added a splash of orange juice, some added a sprinkle of ginger. The carrots came to the table on the same plate as a pork chop or a slice of pot roast, and even the children who refused carrots at lunch would eat them at supper. The brown sugar did the convincing. Glazed carrots were the dish that proved a vegetable could be dessert and side at the same time. Number 27. Fried apples with bacon. Stamen wine saps and June apples had been picked the previous fall by your great-uncle and stored in the cellar under a cloth. By February, they had wrinkled some, but a sharp knife took the skin off in long curls. 3 apples went into a skillet with 2 slices of fatty bacon and a spoonful of brown sugar. The bacon rendered slow, the apples soaked up the fat and the sugar, and they took on the color of dark honey. It was a Saturday breakfast served alongside fried eggs and cat head biscuits. The skillet went onto the supper table still smoking. Number 18. Spaghetti with tomato soup. Before jarred sauce arrived in every grocery aisle, the cheapest hot pasta supper in an American kitchen was made with a red and white can of Campbell's. Boil the spaghetti in a wide pan. Drain. Pour the can of tomato soup right over the noodles. Add the empty soup can full of water, stir in a spoonful of butter, and a hard shake of dried oregano from the tin on the door. Heat through. Italian-American grandmothers in New Jersey would never admit to making it, but their daughters who married out into the suburbs cooked it on Wednesdays when the real sauce was reserved for Sunday. 1 can, 1 pan, 1 starch. The supper hit the table in 15 minutes flat. Children asked for it on their birthdays. Number 18. Church supper hot dish. Ground beef browned in a skillet. A can of cream of mushroom soup. Frozen tater tots layered on top. Baked at 375 until the tots turned crispy and the soup bubbled underneath like a Midwestern promise. This was the dish Mildred Oakes brought to her Baptist church in Pikeville for 14 years. She learned it from her mother-in-law, who learned it from a Lutheran church cookbook published in Mankato, Minnesota in 1930. That cookbook was the first written record of what Minnesotans call hot dish. By 1960, cream of mushroom soup had become so central to church cooking that Lutheran women called it the binder. Not a seasoning, not a shortcut, the binder. The thing that held a church supper together the way hymns held a service together. A can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup cost 15 cents in 1963. A pound of ground beef cost 45 cents. A bag of frozen tater tots cost 29 cents. Mildred's entire casserole fed 8 people for under $1. She tithed 10% of her husband's mining wages every Sunday, and she fed the church every Wednesday on what was left. That was not generosity. That was faith measured in casserole dishes. She never missed a single Wednesday in 14 years. Not when her husband had his accident. Not when her youngest left for Vietnam. She showed up with that hot dish because the church needed feeding and she was the one who fed it. When Mildred died in 1979, the women of the congregation printed her recipe on the back of her memorial card. Brown the beef, add the soup, top with tots, bake until done. That was everything she left behind. That and a church full of people who never went hungry on a Wednesday night. Number 19. Cabbage and salt pork. A head of cabbage cost 9 cents in 1963. A quarter pound of salt pork cost about 12 cents. Together in a single pot, covered with water and simmered for an hour, they became something that fed a table of 6 for under 25 cents total. In the German farming communities of central Missouri and the Czech settlements of South Texas, the pot liquor from the cabbage was considered as valuable as the cabbage itself. Children were given the broth in a cup like a drink. Nothing was left in the pot. That's how cheap and effective this meal was. The salt pork flavored everything it touched, and when you pulled it out after cooking, whatever meat clung to the bone was divided between the smallest children first. The woman at the pot didn't have to be told that. It wasn't discussed. It was understood. You fed the young ones from what was closest to the bone. Back in those days, that was just how it worked. Hominy is corn soaked in an alkaline solution, wood ash, lye, or slaked lime, until the outer hull loosens and the kernel becomes something entirely different, a process called nixtamalization that the Cherokee and other Native American nations had practiced for centuries before European settlers arrived in the Appalachian Mountains and learned it from them. The alkaline treatment unlocked niacin that dried corn could not release on its own, and the settlers who adopted it kept their families healthier without knowing exactly why. By the 1950s, most Appalachian families got their hominy from a can. Van Camp's was the brand most kitchens stocked, warming it in a skillet with butter and cracked black pepper. Old-timers remembered when it was supper itself, heaped into a bowl, eaten hot enough to steam. The flavor was different from grits, blunter and chewier, and anyone who grew up eating it never confused the two. It was its own thing, and the people who understood that distinction are mostly gone. She browned a pound of ground beef in the big skillet, spooned off most of the grease but not all of it, because that fat was the flavor, and then shook flour over the meat until the whole pan went thick and pasty. Milk went in next, slow, stirred constantly, and what came together was a rich, peppery gravy that clung to every grain of the instant rice she spooned onto the plates. Hamburger gravy over rice was the meal that appeared when the grocery money was running thin, but there were still mouths to feed. In some houses, it went over mashed potatoes, in others over toast. But the skillet technique was the same everywhere. Brown, flour, milk, stir, no broth, no wine, no stock from a carton. Just the drippings, the flour, and whatever milk was in the door of the refrigerator. The whole supper cost pennies and filled a kitchen with the smell of something that felt like enough. Some mothers added a can of cream of mushroom soup to stretch it further, and nobody ever complained. Chicken bog was the great equalizer at church gatherings throughout the Carolina Lowcountry, a one-pot rice dish that could feed a congregation on pennies. The preparation began with a whole chicken simmered until the meat fell from the bones, creating a rich broth that would later cook the rice. Cooks would shred every bit of meat, including the dark pieces most people ignored, then return it to the pot with long-grain rice, onions, and generous black pepper. The dish cooked slowly until the rice absorbed the broth and became sticky, with chicken distributed throughout. What made chicken bog special was its democracy. Every spoonful contained the same humble abundance regardless of who held the plate. Church ladies competed quietly over whose bog had the best consistency. Families brought their largest pots to fellowship halls where the smell of simmering chicken announced that community was about to happen. Chicken paprikash was the creamy, paprika-soaked comfort food that looked like it belonged in a cookbook from across the world, yet found its way into suburban kitchens during the 1980s. Made with bone-in or boneless chicken simmered in a sauce of sour cream, onions, butter, and Hungarian paprika, it had warmth, richness, and depth most weeknight meals could only dream of. Served over egg noodles or rice, it became a hearty, comforting dish that families returned to when they wanted something different but still soothing. The sauce was the star, creamy, orange-red, and smoky from the paprika. It clung to every bite of chicken, every forkful of noodles. It was the kind of dinner that made the whole house smell like someone had been cooking for hours. And sometimes they had. But even the quick versions, using canned broth and pre-cooked chicken, managed to hit the mark. Chicken paprikash felt exotic without being intimidating. It was one of those dishes that proved 1980s home cooks were not afraid to explore old-world flavors with modern-day shortcuts. It was not flashy, but it was soulful. Exactly what you needed on a cold night with nothing but time and a plateful of comfort. Bacon-topped tomato pie was one of those strange little miracles that somehow felt fancy and frugal all at once. At its core, it was sliced tomatoes, sometimes fresh from the garden, sometimes canned, layered into a pie crust with mayonnaise, shredded cheese, and a touch of onion. On top went a lattice or crumble of bacon, the kind you saved and froze in wax paper until you had enough. Then it baked until everything melted together in a warm, bubbling mess that smelled like Sunday supper. This dish was especially beloved in Southern church cookbooks, where tomatoes were plentiful and bacon was considered a sacred ingredient. Women's auxiliaries made it for luncheons, potlucks, and summer picnics when it was too hot to cook anything heavier. It walked the line between a side dish and a main course, good enough to carry a meal if needed. Sometimes it had biscuit crusts, sometimes store-bought dough, but it always had that creamy, salty sweet thing going for it. It might not have looked elegant on the plate, but people went back for seconds. That was usually all the proof a church lady needed to call it a hit. French bread pizza was not just a meal, it was an event. Every kid in the 1980s knew the thrill of seeing a halved loaf of crusty French bread slathered in red sauce, buried under gooey mozzarella, and dotted with slices of pepperoni or whatever toppings you had on hand. It baked quickly, smelled incredible, and had just the right amount of crunch and chew. It felt fancier than frozen pizza, more fun than takeout, and more customizable than anything else in the freezer. The sauce came from a jar, the cheese came from a bag, and the bread came from the bakery rack at the supermarket. But when it all came together, it felt like magic. Parents loved it because it was cheap and fast. Kids loved it because it felt like something made just for them. No one argued over slices because everyone got their own half. It was a Friday night tradition, a birthday party standby, and a backup plan for when real dinner plans fell through. It may not have been elegant, but it was full of joy. The jellied chicken loaf was a dish that was made from shredded cooked chicken and homemade gelatin that was made via stock or Knox gelatin packets. You had bare-bones seasonings and some vegetables like cabbages or hard-boiled eggs in the loaf, and it would be served cold as an appetizer for Sunday supper. One of the reasons people would make this dish for Sunday is because it could be made in advance and it was okay to serve it cold, which really cut the work for a lot of home chefs. Plus, this recipe involved cheap cuts of meat, and it was very economical for a lot of people. In the middle of the 20th century, there was also a rise of gelatin-based aspic dishes, but lately all that's gone in the opposite direction. Most people enjoy Jell-O in purely dessert forms now or as a quick snack. There's also just a general distaste for the texture. And for the amount of effort it takes, a lot of people think the idea of a cold jelly meat dish doesn't offer enough bang for your buck. Number 24, stewed tomatoes. Peeling tomatoes over a sink full of ice water was the late August ritual in farmhouse kitchens across Ohio and Pennsylvania and downstate Illinois. A mother dunked the tomatoes in boiling water for 30 seconds, slipped the skins off with her thumb, and quartered the flesh into a heavy saucepan. Sugar went in, a tablespoon of butter, a piece of torn stale bread to soak up the juice and thicken the pot. The pan simmered for an hour while she did the laundry. Stewed tomatoes came to the table in a small glass bowl, sweet and savory at once, the smell of the kitchen for the rest of the afternoon. A jar of stewed tomatoes on the pantry shelf in January meant the August garden was still feeding the family. Stewed tomatoes were the side dish a home garden made inevitable. Number 17, shucky beans with hog jowl. Drying half a bushel of cornfield beans on a back porch table in October was a 2-week job. Beans went on white cloth, turned twice a day, brought in fast if rain looked likely. By November, they rattled in the bag like seed corn. A handful was tipped into the pot with hog jowl from the smokehouse, simmered 5 long hours until the beans softened and the jowl pulled apart. The broth came out smoky and dark, the kind that needed nothing but cornbread. Shuckies were dried by hands that did not stop moving from May until the first frost, and the technique was Cherokee originally, taught to the early Scots-Irish settlers who had no idea how to keep beans through a holler winter without canning jars. Number 22, wieners and sauerkraut. Pennsylvania Dutch grandmothers and Ohio German immigrant wives kept a brown crock of sauerkraut in the cellar year-round, weighted down with a clean river stone. On a Tuesday night, when the meat budget had run thin, they pulled a fistful of the kraut out by hand, dumped it into a deep skillet on the back burner, and laid 8 wieners on top in a neat row. Lid on. 20 minutes on the lowest flame. The kraut turned mellow against the franks, and the franks split their skins. Add a peeled russet potato, cut into chunks once the pot got going, and now you had a 1-pan supper for a family of 6. A short pour of cheap beer halfway through was the grandmother trick that softened the sourness and made the kitchen smell like a Pittsburgh church hall picnic. Number 21, cornbread salad. Crumbled cornbread, canned pinto beans, diced raw onion, layered in a bowl, dressed with nothing but the bean liquid, and served cold. In Alabama and Mississippi, this was the church supper women brought when the kitchen was too hot to turn on the oven. No cooking required. Just yesterday's leftover cornbread turned into tomorrow's potluck offering. A box of Jiffy cornbread mix cost 12 cents in 1968. A can of pinto beans cost 15 cents. The onion came from the garden or cost a penny at the roadside stand. Ida Mae Thompson in Meridian, Mississippi, brought this to Mount Zion Baptist Church every June for 22 years. She told the ladies' circle that cold cornbread salad was the only recipe the Lord gave her, and she was not going to argue with the Lord. The bowl came back clean every time. Number 20, egg drop soup, Depression style. Not the Chinese restaurant version with cornstarch and sesame oil. This was something different entirely. A woman in rural Alabama or the Ozark communities of Missouri browned sliced potatoes and onions in a little lard, added water to fill the pot, seasoned with salt and a bay leaf, and when the broth was rolling, she cracked 2 eggs directly into the pot and stirred fast. The eggs broke into long golden ribbons through the hot broth. It was protein without the cost of meat. Eggs averaged 53 cents a dozen in 1965. For a family of 4, 2 eggs in a pot of broth and potatoes was a full supper for under 20 cents. Nobody called it egg drop soup. It's a simple and beautiful piece of ingenuity. They called it potato broth, or just the egg soup. The name was not important. Getting everyone fed before dark was. Red-eye gravy required exactly 2 things: country ham and black coffee, the stronger the better. You fried the ham, pulled it out, poured a cup of dark coffee over the hot drippings, and scraped the browned bits loose as it hissed. 3 minutes. Done. Some people in Appalachia called it red sop. and the name came from the reddish ring the coffee and fat left at the skillet's edge, darker on the outside, lighter in the center, like an eye. Country ham had been a staple in Virginia and the Mountain South since colonial times, and the tradition of deglazing ham drippings with coffee likely came from Scots-Irish settlers who wasted nothing and never saw a reason to change. You poured it over grits or biscuits, and the bitterness of the coffee cut the salt and fat in a way that shouldn't have worked, but absolutely did. But the quick suppers didn't end with ham. Beneath all that smoky pork lay a whole world of mountain resourcefulness, where garden scraps and foraged food and vegetables nobody else wanted carried as much weight as any cut of meat. Welsh rarebit turned a few slices of bread and a block of sharp cheddar into something that felt almost like a real sit-down dinner, and it took less than 15 minutes from stove to table. Your mother grated the cheese by hand, melted it slow in a saucepan with a splash of milk, a spoonful of dry mustard, and a few shakes of Worcestershire sauce until it went smooth and glossy. That golden sauce got poured thick over toast that had been browned under the broiler, and the whole house smelled like a pub kitchen, warm and sharp and rich. The dish had roots going back to 18th century Wales, where it was called cos poby, toasted cheese, and it crossed the Atlantic as a tavern supper before American mothers claimed it for weeknight duty. Despite the name, there was never any rabbit in it. Just cheese, bread, and the kind of quick thinking that turned almost nothing into a meal that everybody cleaned their plate for. Persimmon pudding was the autumn dessert that appeared at church harvest suppers when wild persimmons ripened on trees throughout the South and Midwest. Gathering the fruit required patience. Persimmons picked before the first frost would pucker mouths with astringent bitterness. But frost-kissed fruit turned honey-sweet and soft enough to push through sieves. Churchwomen processed the pulp together, sharing labor and gossip while filling mason jars for winter baking. The pudding itself was dense, almost custardy, flavored with cinnamon and nutmeg, baked until the top caramelized while the interior stayed moist. Served warm with cream or cold the next day, persimmon pudding connected congregations to the land and to ancestors who had eaten the same fruit from the same trees for generations. What made persimmon pudding precious was its scarcity, appearing only briefly each year. This was survival knowledge disguised as supper, reminding people that nature provided for those who understood. Creamed chipped ham on biscuits was the unofficial supper of Pittsburgh, and it had a way of spreading from city kitchens to country church cookbooks. It was made by chopping thin slices of deli ham, usually chipped or shredded, then simmering them in a white sauce of milk, butter, and flour. The sauce was ladled over fresh biscuits, toast, or even saltines depending on what was around. It was salty, creamy, and stuck to your ribs in the best possible way. This meal started as a working-class favorite, especially in mill towns and coal country, but it worked its way into church kitchens too. It was cheap, it was easy to scale up, and it made use of inexpensive lunch meat that could be bought by the pound. During busy weeks with lots of evening programs or youth nights, it was the kind of meal that filled a crock-pot and waited patiently until everyone was done rehearsing or cleaning pews. Church ladies appreciated how little it cost and how much it satisfied. It was also one of those dishes that made leftovers feel like something special, especially when paired with sweet pickles or stewed apples on the side. Beef and cabbage casserole was a dish you could smell down the church basement stairs long before you saw it. It started with ground beef browned in a skillet, sometimes with onion or a bit of garlic salt. Then came chopped cabbage, tomato soup, and maybe a sprinkle of rice or elbow macaroni to stretch it. All of it went into a casserole dish and baked until the top browned and the edges bubbled up. It was not fancy, but it stuck with you. In colder regions, especially during late fall suppers and Lenten fundraisers, this casserole was a dependable standby. It filled bellies fast and had that tangy sweet tomato flavor people kept coming back for. Some church ladies added Worcestershire sauce or topped it with crushed crackers. Others swore by using V8 juice instead of soup. But no matter the variation, the soul of the dish stayed the same. Cheap beef, fresh or old cabbage, and whatever starch would hold it all together. You could cook it in the morning, reheat it in the evening, and feel good about not spending much. It made its way into church cookbooks because it was a humble classic, the kind of meal that fed people well and asked for very little in return. Lasagna with cottage cheese was the Italian-American supper shortcut that fed every crowd and saved every budget. Ricotta was pricey, cottage cheese, way cheaper, and almost always in the fridge, so families layered noodles, red sauce, ground beef, mozzarella, and cottage cheese into thick trays that baked into gooey, bubbling comfort. It was tangier than traditional lasagna, lighter in texture, and surprisingly addictive. The edges would get crispy, the middle would be molten, and the smell could drag anyone out of their bedroom and into the kitchen. Some people swore it was better than the real thing. Others would never admit they used cottage cheese, even if they loved the taste. But in the 1980s, this was the go-to lasagna for busy households that needed big flavor on a tight budget. It showed up at birthday parties, neighborhood potlucks, and Sunday dinners. It was easy to double, easy to freeze, and easy to love. No, very few things on this list are as bad as this one. Liver and banana casserole was definitely an event in American history. You would combine sliced liver with bananas that had been baked in either a creamy sauce or a really savory one, and then some versions even added cheese on top of it. What people would do to convince themselves that this was tolerable was remind themselves of the fact that the liver is a superfood. You can kind of eat healthy if you treat it like any other chore, right? You get lots of good things for time spent doing something you absolutely hate. Typical job experience, right? Not even that kind of practical rationale could help this dish. A lot of people immediately realized this was an absolute catastrophe that should not ever see the light of day. Fair play to them, not every experiment is going to give you lasagna or salmagundi. But this couldn't have possibly come at a worse time. The liver was already in the public eye for its metallic taste and how bold of a flavor it had. But this was just pushing more and more supporters away from the liver fandom. Then again, if that's the price we had to pay to make sure this thing stays dead, then so be it. Number 29, wilted lettuce salad. Bacon grease did the work that olive oil does now. A mother in a Pennsylvania Dutch farmhouse outside Lancaster would fry 4 strips, pour the hot fat over a bowl of torn leaf lettuce, and call the family before the leaves crisped back. Vinegar went in, a spoonful of sugar, sometimes a sliced hard-boiled egg. The salad was warm, not cold. It tasted like the smell of a Sunday kitchen, smoky and sharp at once. Wilted lettuce showed up on tables in Ohio and West Virginia and Indiana, anywhere a household had a garden and bacon in the icebox. It was not on any restaurant menu in 1962. It was a homemade thing. Wilted lettuce proved heat and vinegar belonged on greens. Number 20, chicken and dumplings. Don't crowd the pot, your grandmother said, letting spoonfuls of dough drop onto the simmering broth a few seconds apart. The chicken was a yard bird that had stopped laying, killed Saturday morning behind the woodshed, plucked over a kettle of boiling water, and singed clean. By Sunday afternoon, it had simmered 3 hours with celery, an onion, a bay leaf, and a chicken back from the previous week. The dumplings were flour, lard, milk, and salt, dropped in for the last 15 minutes. The pot fed 8 people. The smell carried all the way down to the church next door, which is exactly what she wanted, because 3 of those Sunday seats were always for visitors. Leftovers went into a covered dish for Monday. Number 27, cream-chipped beef on toast. The Army called it SOS, and the polite version of what those letters stood for was same old stuff. The recipe was published in the official Army Manual TM10-412 in August of 1944, near the end of the war, after the cooks at base mess halls had been making it for a decade. When the boys came home in 1945 and 1946, they wanted it on Sunday mornings, and their wives learned to make it in the skillet on the back burner. A jar of dried beef from the grocery, a spoonful of flour, a slick of butter melted slow, and a careful pour of milk into the pan. It thickened in 5 minutes. Spoon it over a piece of toast, and that was the cheapest hot supper a young couple could put on the table in a post-war kitchen. Veterans called it the taste of coming back. Number 25, chili and crackers. A church in Tulsa, Oklahoma served this every single Wednesday night from 1958 to 1971. 1 can of chili heated in a pot, a sleeve of saltine crackers on the side, a glass of water. That was church supper for 200 families sitting on metal folding chairs in a fellowship hall that smelled like floor wax and burnt coffee. The chili came from a number 10 can that cost $1.89 and served 15 people. The crackers cost a dime. The women who ran that kitchen did not have a budget. They had a prayer. If you walked into a Piggly Wiggly in 1962, a can of Hormel chili cost 29 cents. You could feed your family of 4 for less than $1 and still bring enough for the church table. That was the math of survival. Not fancy, not proud, just fed. Number 25, water gravy on toast. When there was not any milk, butter, or meat left in the house, there was still flour, water, and the drippings stuck to the bottom of a skillet. Your mother scraped those drippings loose, added a spoonful of flour, stirred until it browned, then poured in enough water to pull it all into a thin, dark gravy. She poured it over toast and set it on the table. In the hollows of West Virginia and the mill towns along the Catawba River in North Carolina, water gravy was the meal that appeared when nothing else was left. It didn't have a name in most households. Back then, families called it gravy and bread because naming it would have made it real. Would have meant saying out loud that the week had run dry. A little bacon drippings made it taste richer than it had any right to. 1 skillet, 5 minutes. No pots to wash. That was enough to put something warm in your stomach before bed. Simple food works that way. Chocolate gravy is exactly the kind of dish that makes people from outside Appalachia raise an eyebrow until they taste it. In Kentucky and Tennessee mountain kitchens, it was made with cocoa powder, flour, sugar, and water. No milk, no butter, cooked until thick and glossy, then spooned hot over biscuits as a supper that was both meal and dessert, and neither one exactly. The recipe spread through families in the Cumberland Plateau from women who knew that sugar and starch could fill a stomach as surely as any meat, and that children who refused beans for the 3rd night running would eat without complaint if something sweet came with it. The wider food world discovered chocolate gravy in the early 2000s and called it Southern, but it was Appalachian first, specific to these mountains. Every family made it slightly differently, some using milk, some adding butter at the end, some keeping no written recipe at all. When your grandmother stopped making it, the version she made stopped existing, and the distance between her version and every other version closed to nothing. Creamed tuna on toast was the Tuesday night answer to everything. Fast, cheap, and warm enough to hold a family together through a long week. Your mother opened a can of chicken of the sea, drained it in the sink, and stirred it into a white sauce she made from butter, flour, and whole milk without once looking at a measuring cup. She knew the roux was ready by the way it bubbled, and she knew the sauce was thick enough when the spoon left a clean trail across the bottom of the pan. Frozen peas went in at the end, still a little firm, the way she liked them. The whole thing got ladled over toast that had been buttered while it was still hot enough to melt it through. In the 1960s, a supper like that cost less than 40 cents and fed 4. You could make it today with the same 5 ingredients and it would taste close, but not the same. The woman who made yours without measuring is the ingredient you cannot buy. Funeral potatoes earned their somber name by appearing at nearly every bereavement meal across rural America, becoming the dish mourner's most expected and appreciated. The preparation was simple. Frozen hash browns mixed with sour cream, cream of chicken soup, shredded cheddar, and butter, then topped with crushed cornflakes and baked until bubbling. The casserole required no skill beyond stirring and could be assembled quickly when grief allowed no time for cooking. Church women kept the ingredients on hand specifically for death, knowing the phone could ring any day with news requiring immediate response. What made funeral potatoes meaningful wasn't culinary artistry, but the message they carried. Someone cared enough to bring food, to show up, to fill a void that grief had emptied. The dish was deliberately bland, comforting without demanding attention. Generations of families came to associate this particular combination with loss and with the community that gathered around it. Hog maw was even worse. This was entirely the stomach lining of a pig. That's about as disgusting as it gets, but it gets worse when you get to the rest of the recipe. You would create this mixture of sausage, potatoes, onions, and spices, and then you would stuff the stomach lining with that. This wasn't the last step, since you had to boil it too. Now, some people baked it, but boiling it typically was the way to go because the stomach lining needed to be tenderized. This was something you would see a lot in Pennsylvania Dutch communities and Southern cooking. Some regional differences were things like whether or not the entire stomach would be served or whether it would just be used as a casing. Nose-to-tail eating had become extremely popular in the early parts of the 20th century because the mentality of not wasting a single bit of the animal was what kids had grown up on. Combine that with the fact that you'd be helping Dad out by taking one for the team and eating this with a smile, and you had both a logical and an emotional reason to force yourself through this. Even that couldn't save hog maw for too long because the preparation for it was just as much of a headache as eating it was, which really just made people question what they were even doing with this recipe anymore. Turkey croquettes with gravy were one of those elegant little tricks church ladies knew how to pull off after a holiday dinner. Leftover turkey would be shredded, mixed with a white sauce or mashed potatoes, then shaped into tidy little patties or oblong logs. Some rolled them in cracker crumbs, others used cornflake dust for the coating. Then they were fried to a golden brown and served warm with gravy poured right over the top. These were not everyday meals. They were for after Easter or Thanksgiving when the bird had been picked clean and the bones had already gone to soup. But nothing went to waste. Not the drippings, not the stuffing, and definitely not the last bits of meat. Church cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s are full of croquette recipes, especially in regions where thrift and grace went hand in hand. These were also popular with church auxiliary groups and potluck planners who needed something warm, filling, and presentable to serve a crowd. They looked nice on a platter, they reheated easily, and they made a little leftover go a long way. In small towns and church halls, that was always worth something. Tuna noodle casserole was either your favorite or your nightmare, but either way, it showed up often and meant you were home. The formula never changed. Egg noodles, canned tuna, frozen peas, and cream of mushroom soup all stirred together and baked until hot and thick. The finishing move? A crunchy crown of crushed potato chips, sometimes cornflakes, always something salty and golden. It came in a square dish that seemed bottomless. You would scoop out a portion and find yourself going back for more because it was weirdly addictive. Cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, it became the undisputed champion of weeknight meals for families trying to stretch a dollar. Some versions added chopped celery or onion. Others stayed true to the original, built on cans and carbs. It was a casserole that smelled like your grandmother's house. It could feed a family of 6 on pennies. And it tasted like a relic of a time when everything came from the pantry and nobody cared if the tuna was fancy. Stuffed beef heart actually is as weird as it sounds. An entire beef heart had to be cleaned and stuffed before the dish was a meal, and while this might sound like some rich person's hobby, just collecting beef hearts to cook, it was actually a frugal meal. The heart was a very tough organ. It was covered by hard muscle and tissue that just made it very undesirable for customers and butchers alike. Most shops would discard it or sell it at a fraction of the price they were selling other things. Hence why a lot of people took to this, not out of a craving for beef heart, but just so they could stretch their paycheck a little longer. Again, nose-to-tail eating did decline, but even then, this is just as extreme as a calf's head. Why do we have to eat either the head or the heart? You tell me. Either way, I'm glad that this is out of style because I genuinely cannot imagine what I would do if I visited someone's palace and they served me a heart stuffed with cabbage, lettuce, and onions. Like, that's scary. Number 30. Skillet corn. Cooking sweet corn in a hot pan was the side a mother started after she put the meatloaf in the oven. The corn came off the cob in summer and out of a can the other 10 months. Butter went in first, then the corn, then sugar and salt and pepper. Some mothers added a splash of cream at the end. Some added bacon drippings from the coffee can on the stove. The whole thing took 5 minutes. It was Iowa corn in July and niblets in February, and the difference mattered less than the clock. A working mother in a Cedar Rapids suburb could put skillet corn on the table while she finished pork chops, and nobody asked for a recipe. The pan was the recipe. Skillet corn proved a hot pan, and a little butter could solve almost any vegetable. Number 28. Cathead biscuits with sawmill gravy. Your great-aunt in Wise County, Virginia, set out 3 biscuits at 5 each morning for the boarding house table. 6 men paid $1 a week to sleep on her enclosed porch and eat what she put down. The biscuits got their name from their size, each one as big as a tomcat's head, pulled apart by hand and never cut with a glass. White lily flour, lard worked in cold, buttermilk poured cool from the milk safe. Dough was patted out on a floured board and dropped in shaggy rounds onto a hot iron pan. Sawmill gravy went over them, made from sausage drippings, flour, milk, and black pepper, enough to make a grown man cough. The whole breakfast cost her 32 cents a head to set out in 1962. The men ate 9 biscuits between them and went out the kitchen door without speaking. The recipe had come over with her Scotch-Irish great-grandmother 2 generations before the railroad ever cut through the gap. The biscuits were always hot. Number 24. Tuna noodle skillet. The pantry version came together in one pan on top of the stove. No oven, no second dish, no extra rinse. Boil a handful of egg noodles right in a wide pan with 2 cups of milk and a knob of butter. When the noodles softened, in went a drained can of chicken of the sea, a can of peas from the cellar shelf, and a fistful of crushed potato chips on top for what 1950s women called the topping. Lid on for 2 minutes, then straight to the table. Grandmothers in church basements served the casserole version on Wednesdays, but the weeknight skillet version was what tired wives in post-war suburbs actually cooked when the husband came home from the factory at 6 and the children had baths at 7. Number 11. Deviled egg casserole. A dozen hard-boiled eggs, a can of cream of celery soup, breadcrumbs on top. The eggs were halved, the yolks scooped out and mixed with mustard and a little of the soup, then stuffed back into the whites and arranged in a baking dish. The rest of the soup was poured over the top, the breadcrumbs scattered like dust, and the whole thing baked for 20 minutes. This was the dish that church ladies invented when they had too many eggs and not enough imagination to make anything else. But it worked. A dozen eggs cost 57 cents in 1965. The soup cost 15 cents. The breadcrumbs cost a dime. And the result tasted like your grandmother's deviled eggs had married a casserole and settled down in a fellowship hall somewhere in Indiana. Deviled eggs were already the most fought-over item on every potluck table in America. Turning them into a casserole meant they lasted longer and fed more people. That was number 22, tomato gravy on biscuits. When the garden exploded with tomatoes in August and there was nothing else ready to pick, a woman in rural Tennessee or the upland counties of Georgia made tomato gravy. She melted bacon grease in a skillet, added a spoonful of flour and let it brown, then poured in garden tomatoes she had crushed by hand. Salt, a pinch of sugar, black pepper. She stirred it until the flour and tomatoes became something thicker, tangier, and more satisfying than either one alone. Poured over split biscuits, it was a full meal. By mid-September, when the tomatoes were coming in faster than they could be canned, families ate this 4 or 5 nights running. It did not feel like poverty food when the tomatoes were that ripe. It felt like the best time of the year. Healthy, filling, free from the garden. Appalachian communities still make tomato gravy today. They don't call it poverty food. They call it summer. Tomato gravy started in the bacon grease left from breakfast. A spoon of flour stirred in until the roux turned pale gold, then a quart of home-canned tomatoes dumped in and mashed down with a fork. The whole thing thickened in the time it took to split the biscuits. It wasn't a sauce. It was a gravy. And there's a difference any mountain cook would insist on, because a sauce is something fancy, and a gravy is what you make when supper has to come from the shelf. Families across Kentucky and West Virginia kept canned tomatoes year-round for this dish, putting up 40 or 50 quarts each August so that winter suppers had something red and hot to pour over bread. The trick was the roux. You couldn't rush it. and the women who made this knew the exact moment the flour changed from raw to ready just by the way the skillet smelled. You poured it over biscuits that were already cold, and the gravy brought them back to life. The last jar of tomatoes in February had a different weight to it, and she always said so. Nobody in the house called it American goulash. It was just the skillet or that macaroni thing or whatever name your family gave the one-pan supper that showed up every other Thursday. Elbow macaroni, ground beef browned with onion, a can of stewed tomatoes, and sometimes a handful of whatever cheese was getting hard in the back of the refrigerator. In New England, they called it American chop suey, though it had nothing to do with anything Chinese. In the Midwest, it was just goulash, though a real Hungarian cook would not have recognized a single thing about it. The secret was the stewed tomatoes. You used Del Monte or Hunt's and you never drained them because that juice was your sauce. The pot sat on the stove and kids served themselves seconds and thirds. Nobody plated it, nobody garnished it, nobody called it a recipe. It was just what you ate on the nights nobody had time to think. Scripture cake was a beloved tradition that turned baking into Bible study, with each ingredient referenced by chapter and verse. Church women would share handwritten recipes listing ingredients only as scriptural citations. Judges 5:25 for butter, Jeremiah 6:20 for sugar, Isaiah 10:14 for eggs, requiring bakers to look up each passage before measuring. The resulting cake was dense, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, studded with figs and raisins mentioned throughout the Old Testament. Making scripture cake became a teaching tool for Sunday school classes, with children racing to find verses while mothers measured and mixed. What made this tradition meaningful was how it wove faith directly into everyday nourishment, reminding families that sustenance came from both physical and spiritual sources. The recipe cards were treasured and passed between generations, often tucked into family Bibles alongside birth and death records. Bacon-topped tomato pie was one of those strange little miracles that somehow felt fancy and frugal all at once. At its core, it was sliced tomatoes, sometimes fresh from the garden, sometimes canned, layered into a pie crust with mayonnaise, shredded cheese, and a touch of onion. On top went a lattice or crumble of bacon, the kind you saved and froze in wax paper until you had enough. Then it baked until everything melted together in a warm, bubbling mess that smelled like Sunday supper. This dish was especially beloved in Southern church cookbooks, where tomatoes were plentiful and bacon was considered a sacred ingredient. Women's auxiliaries made it for luncheons, potlucks, and summer picnics when it was too hot to cook anything heavier. It walked the line between a side dish and a main course, good enough to carry a meal if needed. Sometimes it had biscuit crusts, sometimes store-bought dough, but it always had that creamy, salty sweet thing going for it. It might not have looked elegant on the plate, but people went back for seconds. That was usually all the proof a church lady needed to call it a hit. Rice ring with creamed mushrooms was the kind of supper dish that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, but came from a 5-ingredient recipe in the back of a spiral-bound church cookbook. You would mold cooked rice, flavored with butter and maybe a bouillon cube, into a ring using a bundt pan or gelatin mold. Then you would fill the center with creamed mushrooms made from a simple white sauce and canned or fresh mushrooms sautéed in butter. It held its shape, looked impressive, and tasted warm and earthy. Dishes like this were popular for Sunday socials and women's luncheons, where the goal was to serve something filling that still had a little flair. Church ladies knew presentation mattered, especially when the ingredients were plain. Rice was cheap, mushrooms could be foraged or bought in bulk, and butter made everything feel a bit more special. This was a dish that traveled well, reheated easily, and made just enough fuss to feel intentional without being fussy. You could feed a dozen people without breaking a sweat, or your grocery budget, and if there was any left, it was even better the next day. Taco salad in a Doritos bag was the definition of fun food, half salad, half chaos, and all 1980s genius. The setup was simple. Ground beef cooked with taco seasoning, shredded lettuce, cheddar cheese, maybe some diced tomatoes or sour cream, and a big handful of nacho cheese Doritos. Some families mixed it all in a bowl. Others, the bold ones, served it straight from the bag. You would crunch up the chips, pour in the toppings, shake it up, and dig in with a fork. It was portable. It was messy. It was delicious. And it felt like breaking the rules in the best way. This was dinner that did not sit properly on a plate. It made kids excited to eat salad. It gave busy parents a break. And it tasted like everything good about the 1980s. Salty, cheesy, just a little bit ridiculous. You could call it a meal, a snack, or a party trick. But however it showed up, it never lasted long. Taco salad in a Doritos bag was food with a wink. Beef tongue in aspic is one of the biggest examples of that. It was a really classic European-style dish, and it had boiled beef tongue, which was still something people were a lot more open towards given the times. The issue started when people began to encase it in aspic, and the gelatin was also made from bone broth. It would be flavored with vinegar or wine and herbs, and the dish would typically be served cold. Now, I just want you to imagine that for a second. You're eating beef tongue, which is hard, chewy, and just foreign to you texture-wise, boiled, cold, and encased in jelly with distracting herbs thrown in. Can you actually believe this used to be something people had at formal dinners? I mean, I get throwing meat in a spick because it lasted longer and refrigerators weren't a thing, but this has to be some kind of food sadism. Number 23, hot German potato salad. Vinegar was the trick that separated this potato salad from every other potato salad in the country. A mother in a Milwaukee bungalow with German grandparents would boil red potatoes in their skins, slice them warm into a bowl, and pour over them a sauce of bacon grease, cider vinegar, sugar, and crisp bacon bits. The salad was served hot, not cold. It tasted like Sunday lunch in a Wisconsin parish hall. The dressing soaked in and turned the bowl tangy and rich at once. Heinz vinegar ran ads all through the 1960s built around this dish, because every German-American household in Milwaukee and Cincinnati was making it without a card. Hot German potato salad was the side immigrant grandmothers kept alive through their daughters. Number 30, soup beans with cornbread. In 1965, your great-grandmother's deep pot sat on the back of a coal stove in Mingo County and simmered from breakfast until supper. Pintos had been soaked the night before in cold well water, picked clean of stones at supper time by whichever child she could trust. Streak-o-lean from the smokehouse went in at first light, with a halved onion and a touch of pepper. The broth darkened to the color of strong tea over 4 quiet hours. Cornbread baked in your iron pan for the last 20 minutes, lard crackling around the rim. A bowl of beans, a wedge of pone crumbled in, a cup of sweet milk on the side. That was supper for a household of 6, made for under 15 cents a head. Your great-grandfather walked the 3 miles home from the cage, knowing exactly what would be waiting. The pot was always there. Number 28, slumgullion. The word showed up in Mark Twain's 1872 travelogue Roughing It, where he used it to mean a watery stew served to gold miners. By the time the Depression hit, the name had attached itself to a thick beef and noodle pot that hobos shared along the railroad lines through the Dakotas and Montana. Grandmothers who fed men off the boxcars in the 1930s kept making it long after the trains stopped bringing strangers. Brown a pound of ground beef in a deep skillet. Throw in a chopped onion, a green pepper if you had one, a can of tomato sauce, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a cup of dry elbow macaroni. Cover the pan. Walk away for 20 minutes. Some families called it American goulash. Some called it just supper. The name moved with the people who carried it, and the recipe stayed almost the same from Pennsylvania to the Pacific. It was the supper a woman could put together with one hand on the spoon and the other on a child's shoulder. Number 22, Jell-O salad. 1 box of lime gelatin, 1 can of crushed pineapple, 1 cup of cottage cheese. Mixed together, poured into a mold, and chilled until it set into something that jiggled and shimmered under the fluorescent lights of every church basement in America. By 1955, Jell-O had become a status symbol for housewives who owned a refrigerator. The gelatin cost 10 cents a box. The pineapple cost 15. An entire Pentecostal congregation in Wheeling, West Virginia, ate Jell-O salad every 4th Sunday for a decade, because Lois Prater brought a pan so large it barely fit through the fellowship hall door. She made it the night before and carried it in both arms like a sleeping child. This was not a side dish. This was an act of devotion from a woman who believed that feeding your church was the same as feeding your faith. Nobody made their own, they just waited for Lois. Number 24. Cornmeal mush with milk. A pot of water, a cup of cornmeal, a pinch of salt. Stir it until it thickened. Pour it into a bowl with warm milk over the top and a thread of sorghum if you had it. That was supper. In farm communities across southern Indiana and the hill country of southern Ohio, cornmeal mush appeared on the table 3 or 4 nights a week in lean seasons. A pound of yellow cornmeal cost 8 cents in 1963. A family of 5 could eat for under a dime. What most people do not know is that leftover mush was sliced cold the next morning, fried crispy in the same skillet it was cooked in, and eaten with syrup for breakfast. Nothing was wasted. The pot was rinsed, not scrubbed. The cornmeal cooked right down to the bottom would flavor the next batch. That was the whole recipe, and it stretched across 2 meals. Fatback had no glamour. It was the part of the hog nobody else wanted. Pure white fat salted and stored in a crock. But in Appalachian kitchens from the 1930s through the 1960s, it was the engine of every meal. You sliced it thin, laid it in a cold skillet, and let it render slow. By the time the slices went brown and rigid at the edges, the pan was full of clear golden fat worth more than the meat itself. The crackling slices got eaten, salty, crunchy, intensely porky, but the drippings went into a jar by the stove that was never empty if the family was doing all right. A half pound of fatback cost a few cents at the company store in coal towns across West Virginia and eastern Kentucky, and it seasoned every pot of beans, every skillet of greens, every pan of cornbread for a month. You didn't measure. You poured until the color looked right, and if you had to ask what that meant, you hadn't spent enough time watching. The jar by the stove was the first thing to disappear when the next generation moved to town. Your father knew this dish by a name that could not be repeated at the dinner table, the one the soldiers called it in the mess halls of World War II, where it showed up on metal trays so often that men dreamed about it decades after they came home. Creamed chipped beef on toast started with a small glass jar of armor-dried beef, so salty your mother soaked the thin slices in warm water twice before she tore them into pieces and stirred them into a butter and flour roux. Milk turned it into gravy, black pepper finished it, and the whole thing got ladled over toast. White bread, always white bread. By the early 1960s, Stauffer's and Banquet both sold frozen versions in boil-in-bag pouches, but the homemade kind had a richness the freezer aisle could never match. The dish survived because it cost next to nothing and fed a family on pantry staples alone. Your mother made it without apology, and if anyone complained, she reminded them their father ate worse in the Pacific. Burgundy stew was the Sunday dinner centerpiece at churches where immigrant families brought old-world cooking traditions to American fellowship halls. Tough cuts of beef were browned in batches, then simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes in a rich broth deepened with tomato paste and whatever wine the family could spare. The long cooking time transformed cheap, sinewy meat into fork-tender pieces that fell apart at the slightest pressure. Churchwomen would start the stew Saturday evening, letting it simmer through the night so flavors could meld and deepen by Sunday morning. The aroma would fill entire church basements, drawing families toward the fellowship hall before services even ended. What made Burgundy stew meaningful was how it turned patience into flavor and economy into abundance. A single pot could feed 30 people, with crusty bread for sopping up the rich gravy. This was immigrant cooking adapted for American congregations, proving that old traditions found new homes in church kitchens. Candle stub melting rescued remaining wax from burned-down candles to create new light sources that extended illumination indefinitely. When candles burned too low to use, families saved the stubs in containers until enough accumulated. The wax was melted together in double boilers or cans set in hot water, then poured into molds around new wicks. The resulting candles might be multicolored from combined stubs, but they burned just as well as store-bought alternatives. Some families saved wicks from old candles too, or made new ones from cotton string. The practice mattered especially in rural areas where electricity arrived late or remained unreliable. Even after electric lights became standard, candles served during outages and provided atmosphere for special occasions. Melting stubs became family projects, with children helping pour wax and position wicks. The recycled candles represented light literally created from what others discarded, illumination that cost nothing beyond the initial candle purchases that started the cycle. Ham and noodle skillet was the kind of meal that came together in a single pan on a busy Wednesday night before choir practice. It started with leftover ham, cubed, chopped, or shaved off the bone, tossed into a hot skillet with egg noodles and a handful of peas. Some folks added mushrooms, others just stirred in a spoonful of sour cream or a pat of butter to keep it rich. The result was warm, salty, and filling with just enough green to count as a vegetable. You could find this dish in nearly every Lutheran or Methodist church cookbook from the 1950s to the 1970s. It was fast, forgiving, and perfect for when dinner needed to be on the table in 20 minutes flat. No oven, no timer, just a stovetop, a wooden spoon, and a skillet. That was part of the appeal. It worked for the women who had worked all day and still had a bake sale to prep for or a committee meeting to attend. Kids ate it without complaint, and men liked it because it tasted like a meal. In homes and churches where time and money were always tight, the ham and noodle skillet got the job done. Hamburger pie, also known as shepherd's pie in its Americanized form, was one of those dishes that came from scraps and turned into gold. It started with a layer of seasoned ground beef, sometimes with onions or gravy, sometimes just straight from the pan. Then came the creamy corn, usually from a can, poured right over the top like it belonged there. The final touch was a thick layer of mashed potatoes, piped on or spooned roughly, spread edge to edge. Some people topped it with shredded cheddar, others left it plain. It baked until the potatoes browned at the edges and the whole thing bubbled at the seams. It was a one-dish wonder, Midwestern, humble, and filling in every way. If your family had hamburger pie in the oven, you knew you were in for something warm and grounding. It was never flashy, but it always delivered. It was especially great for stretching ingredients and feeding a family on a tight budget. The layers came together in a forkful that tasted like every corner of the plate at once. The mock duck was a substitute dish for duck meat, also made in times like the Great Depression, mostly because duck meat had become such a luxury. There was a type of gluten made out of wheat known as seitan, and you would roll that and stuff it to make this. Conceptually, I think people were trying to mimic duck breasts. You would pan-fry these just like them too, or roast them and serve with any kind of gravy. Now, this doesn't really sound that bad, right? Relatively normal compared to the rest of the nightmares we've been going through. Wrong? It was made of organic meat, or strictly vegetarian ingredients, both of which were really bad at capturing the texture or flavor of duck, or just coming anywhere close to it, really. The only momentum this dish had going for it was that veganism was on the rise thanks to health concerns, overfishing hazards, and environmental damages. People were significantly more excited about real duck meat when it did eventually become affordable and accessible, and most mock food is now left behind in the past. Let's be honest, it was smart, but that doesn't mean it was good. Number 26, 3-bean salad. By Thursday evening, the church supper committee had 100 paper plates stacked on a folding table and a glass bowl of 3-bean salad in the middle of the room. A can of green beans, a can of wax beans, a can of kidney beans, all drained and rinsed, a diced onion, a chopped green pepper, vinegar, sugar, vegetable oil, salt, pepper, stirred together in a measuring cup and poured over the beans. The bowl went into the icebox overnight. By Friday potluck, it had soaked up every flavor in the jar. A working mother could throw 3-bean salad together in 12 minutes on a Wednesday and serve it on a Sunday. It traveled well. It did not wilt. It fed 20 people from one mixing bowl, and the leftovers tasted better than the first serving. 3-bean salad was the side dish a potluck schedule made famous. Number 23. Apple stack cake. The cake had 6 thin layers, each baked on a pie tin in a wood oven, separated by spiced dried apples cooked down with sorghum and cinnamon. Jenny Wilson taught it to her daughters on Beach Mountain in North Carolina, and her daughters carried it into Tennessee and Kentucky in the 1930s. By 1965, your grandmother made it for funerals, weddings, and Christmas Eve. The cake had to sit covered in a dish towel for a full day so the apple filling soaked through the layers. The flour cost a dime, the sorghum was traded for eggs, the dried apples were free from the September pickings. The whole cake came in under 45 cents and fed 22 people at a wake. Nobody ever wrote that recipe down. They watched. Number 16. Fried bologna hash. The thick-cut deli bologna from the meat counter cost half what ground beef cost in 1961, and grandmothers in West Virginia and Eastern Kentucky knew that down to the penny. Dice a half pound of bologna into rough half-inch cubes on the cutting board next to the sink. Brown it hard in her iron pan until the edges curled and crisped and the kitchen smelled like a diner counter. Add a chopped yellow onion, a diced cold-boiled potato left over from last night, and a hit of black pepper from the tin. Press the whole hash flat with the back of the spoon. Let it crust on the bottom for 4 minutes without moving it. Flip the whole slab once, crack 2 eggs right on top, lid on, 3 more minutes. Supper for 4 out of last night's leftovers and a tube of cheap lunch meat from the corner store. Number 20. Pork and beans with Frank's. 1 can of pork and beans, 2 hot dogs sliced into coins, a squirt of mustard stirred in, heated on the stove for 10 minutes and brought to church in a covered pot. In 1965, a can of Van Camp's pork and beans cost 13 cents. A package of hot dogs cost 49 cents and made 4 servings. This was the Wednesday night supper that single mothers brought because it was the one thing their children would eat without complaint and the one thing they could make after a 10-hour shift at the textile mill. It never won any ribbons. But the pot was always empty by the end of the night. Always. That told you everything you needed to know about who was eating and what they could afford. The women who made it did not need praise. They needed the pot back by Sunday. Number 15. Rice and gravy. In the bayou country of South Louisiana and the rice farming counties of East Texas, rice and gravy was not a side dish. It was the meal itself. Beef drippings from whatever cut had been cooked the day before, reheated and thickened with flour and water into a brown gravy that soaked into the rice until every grain was dark and glossy. Families in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, ate this 3 nights a week. The pot that made the gravy was the same pot used to cook the rice. 1 burner, 1 pot, 1 meal. The secret, if there was one, was patience over the roux, which required stirring over a medium flame until the flour went from raw to deep brown without burning. Every Cajun grandmother had her own timing for this. None of them wrote it down. You learned it by standing next to her at the stove until the smell was right. That's how the best skills move through generations. White half-runner beans were not the beans you bought at a grocery store. They were a specific Appalachian heirloom variety, a pole bean with a creamy white hull and a green runner, developed over generations by mountain gardeners in the region, stretching from southwestern Virginia through eastern Tennessee and into western North Carolina. They grew on poles. They had to be strung and broken by hand, and the children old enough to sit still were expected to help. They cooked faster than dried pintos and tasted different, earthier, starchier, with a flavor that people from outside the region found hard to describe and people from inside recognized instantly as home. You put them in a pot with fatback and water, brought them to a boil, and let them go until they were soft enough to mash with your tongue. You didn't time it. You tasted. The seeds were passed between families the way recipes should be. No paperwork, just a jar over the fence in the fall. When families stopped growing gardens, the half-runner slipped away with them. Nobody in your mother's kitchen had ever been to Spain, but Spanish rice showed up on the table at least twice a month anyway. A 1-skillet supper that required nothing more than ground beef, a green pepper, an onion, a cup of rice, and a can of tomatoes. She browned the beef first, drained most of the fat, Then added the chopped vegetables and let them soften before the rice and tomatoes went in. A lid, 20 minutes on low heat, and the rice absorbed everything until each grain was stained red and swollen with flavor. Betty Crocker published a version in her 1961 cookbook that called for a teaspoon of chili powder, which most mothers either ignored or doubled depending on how their husbands felt about heat. The dish had no real connection to Spanish cuisine. The name came from the tomatoes, which somebody decades earlier had decided made anything Spanish. You ate it with a glass of milk and a slice of buttered bread on the side, and you did not ask questions about the name. Stack pie was the community dessert that required multiple families working together, each contributing a thin layer to a towering finished product. Church women would bake individual pie crust thin layers flavored with spices and molasses, then stack them with apple butter or dried apple filling between each layer until the pie reached 6 inches or higher. The assembled pie rested for days, allowing moisture from the filling to soften the layers into a unified whole that sliced cleanly and tasted of concentrated autumn. This wasn't a dessert one family could make alone. The labor of rolling multiple layers, the apple butter made from community pressing parties, the assembly requiring steady hands, all demanded cooperation. What made stack pie remarkable was how its creation mirrored the community that ate it, with individual contributions becoming something greater than any part. Churches served stack pie at homecoming suppers when families returned to ancestral congregations, its presence signaling that traditions still mattered. Baked ziti with jarred sauce was the Italian-American supper that could feed an army without breaking a sweat. It was not lasagna, but it hit all the same notes: gooey cheese, rich tomato sauce, and plenty of pasta. Ziti noodles were cooked just until tender, then tossed with store-bought marinara or meat sauce. Italian sausage or meatballs often joined the party. Everything got layered into a baking dish with shredded mozzarella and sometimes a bit of Parmesan on top. Into the oven it went, bubbling until the edges were crisp and the cheese was pulling in every direction. It was hearty, cheap, and perfect for leftovers. Baked ziti was a weeknight miracle. It could be made in bulk, served at potlucks, or frozen for later. You knew what you were getting every single time, and that consistency made it one of the most loved casseroles of the 1980s. It was red-sauced joy, one scoop at a time. Some families added ricotta, some skipped the meat, but everyone had a version. Peanut butter and onion sandwiches might sound like a dare, but in old rural churches, they were just another kind of honest food. You would slice a sweet white onion thin, Vidalia if you had it, and layer it between 2 slices of bread spread thick with peanut butter. No toasting, no grilling, just straight-up lunchbox material. Sometimes people added lettuce or mustard, but most stuck to the basic version. This odd little combination came from the South and made its way into handwritten cookbooks and potluck menus, usually with a note that read, "Do not knock it till you try it." These sandwiches were common among farming families and church workers who needed protein and flavor on the cheap. And they delivered. The sweetness of the peanut butter and the bite of the onion somehow worked together, especially when paired with a glass of sweet tea or a handful of pickles. They were not gourmet, but they were quick and filled a hole. And if you happen to grow up with them, there is a good chance you still crave one when no one is watching. Chicken divan was the queen of creamy casseroles, a dish that somehow made broccoli feel like a luxury. Families would pile cooked chicken and steamed broccoli into a baking dish, then drown it in a sauce made from cream of chicken soup, a splash of sherry, and a heaping handful of shredded cheddar. It was finished with golden breadcrumbs and baked until bubbling. The name made it sound fancy, but it was pure 1980s comfort food, easy, affordable, and surprisingly rich. It could be made ahead of time, frozen, or doubled for potlucks. If your mother was trying to impress dinner guests without working too hard, this was what she made. Kids might have rolled their eyes at the broccoli, but by the second bite, nobody was complaining. The creaminess covered everything. Even if you hated vegetables, you liked this. It was the dish that made your mother feel like she was serving fine dining even when it came out of a can. Frog leg fricassee was this stewed dish that would involve frog legs that had really just been browned lightly in butter. They were simmered in a really creamy sauce too, with wine, onions, garlic, and herbs. Doesn't sound bad, right? I'm sure a sizable amount of us have gone fishing for frogs, maybe even eaten a few in our lifetimes. At least our older viewers might be able to relate. The idea was basically that you would sauté meat and stew it in this white sauce, and then you would use seasonings as per your taste. Most people kept it aromatic and herbal, but there were people who tried different spice rubs as well, typically in the South and Midwest. Wild frogs also used to be abundant in rural America in general, and a lot of people just thought they were a really convenient source of protein. Frog legs were still something that French and Cajun communities ate occasionally, but many people thought it was very off-putting. Besides, amphibians are usually seen as weird. It's not the kind of meat people are used to eating. They're not even farmed that much in the United States. It's not seen as exotic, quirky, trendy, or experimental. It's just odd and strange to people, which is a big part of why frog legs fell off. You have no idea the damage bad social perception can deal to a recipe's lifespan. Number 25, macaroni salad. Hellmann's mayonnaise carried this dish across the suburbs through the decade. A pound of elbow macaroni boiled and cooled, 2 cups of Hellmann's, a chopped celery rib, a diced sweet pickle, a hard-boiled egg, a sprinkle of paprika. That was the recipe, except there was no recipe, only a feel for it. A mother in Wanta or Hicksville would make a bowl on Saturday morning and serve it through Tuesday lunch. Macaroni salad rode in a Tupperware bowl to backyard cookouts and came back out for sandwiches the next day. It was cheap, filling, and forgiving. Macaroni salad was the side that fed a working week from one bowl. Number 25, salt pork gravy on biscuits. The salt pork came from a sack at Sears Roebuck, 3 pounds for $1.15, kept in a covered crock by the warming oven. A wife in a coal camp at Lynch, Kentucky, sliced 4 thin strips before dawn in 1963, fried them gold, and made a flour gravy in the drippings with milk poured cool. Your great-grandfather ate his standing up, his lunch bucket already packed, and walked to the cage with the taste of pork fat and pepper still on his tongue. The whole breakfast cost 23 cents. He went down for 9 hours on it, came up black, and ate the same thing the next morning. What most people forget about a coal camp breakfast is that it did not just feed a man. It told him somebody had been awake before him. Number 23, beanie weenies. Van Camps came out with their pork and bean can during the Civil War years, and by the 1930s, the cheapest hot supper in a tenement kitchen was a can of those beans opened with a hand-cranked opener and dumped into a pan with sliced franks. The whole thing warmed through in about 7 minutes on a low flame. Grandmothers in Pittsburgh and Cleveland fed it to night shift husbands on Sunday evenings before the mill whistle blew at 10. Children called it beanie weenies and asked for it on Fridays after the bathwater cooled. The molasses in the beans was the only sweetness most families saw in a week, and the franks gave the pot its salt. Spoon a ladleful over a slice of buttered Wonder Bread, and the bread soaked up the sauce, and the plate came back clean before the radio program had even started. Number 24, scalloped potatoes. 3 potatoes, a cup of milk, a tablespoon of butter, sliced thin, layered in a dish, and baked until the edges turned golden and the center went soft and creamy. That was the entire recipe that appeared in a 1947 Methodist Ladies' Aid cookbook from Ames, Iowa. No cheese, no onion, no seasoning beyond salt. The milk and butter did all the work, turning raw potatoes into something that tasted the way a warm kitchen feels on a January evening. A 10-pound bag of potatoes cost 53 cents in 1950. 1 bag made enough scalloped potatoes to fill 3 church pans. Women like Darlene Hatcher in Des Moines made this every 3rd Sunday for the covered dish table and never once heard a complaint. Your grandmother did not need a recipe card. She needed a knife, a pan, and enough patience to let the oven do the rest. The pan came home empty every time. Number 17, Hoover stew. Named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover, who left office in 1933 with bread lines stretching around city blocks, Hoover stew lived on in American kitchens for 30 more years after the Depression officially ended. Macaroni noodles, sliced hot dogs, a can of stewed tomatoes, and a can of corn. All in one pot. Boil the macaroni, add the rest, let it simmer until the tomatoes had soaked into the pasta. In shantytown communities called Hoovervilles during the 1930s, this exact formula fed hundreds out of community pots. By the 1960s, it had moved, generation by generation, into the kitchens of working-class families in Cleveland and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, where it was just called mac and hot dogs. A package of macaroni was 19 cents in 1965. A can of tomatoes was 15 cents. 4 hot dogs stretched to feed 5 people. That was dinner for under 50 cents. The name Hoover had long since been forgotten. The meal hadn't. Squirrel was free, and in the hills of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, free meat meant everything when the alternative was money the family didn't have. A single gray squirrel filled a skillet. 2 or 3 made a proper supper. Brown the pieces in hot lard until the outside crisped. Pull them out. Add flour and water. Stir until the gravy thickened and turned a deep brown. And what you had was something wild and slightly nutty that no store-bought package ever matched. The squirrel hunting season in Appalachian communities was a social institution. Men and boys went out together in the early morning the way their fathers had, and what came back fed everyone for days. Mark Sohn, the food historian and author of Appalachian Home Cooking, documented squirrel gravy as one of the defining dishes of mountain Kentucky food culture, a dish that required no recipe because the women who made it had been making it their whole lives, as had the women who taught them. The knowledge lived in the hands, not in any written-down place, and when the hands stopped, so did the gravy. Scalloped corn was the dish that traveled, to church suppers, to funeral dinners, to the neighbor's house when a new baby arrived. Your mother made it in a glass baking dish with 2 cans of cream-style corn, a sleeve of crushed saltine crackers, a couple of beaten eggs, a pour of milk, and enough butter to make the top go golden and crispy in the oven. Some women added diced onion, others stirred in a can of whole kernel corn for texture. In the Midwest, where the dish was strongest through the 1950s and 60s, every woman at the potluck brought her own version, and every version was slightly different, and nobody shared exactly how they made theirs. The recipe was never written down because it did not need to be. 2 cans, crackers, eggs, milk, butter, bake until set. It was the dish that showed up when somebody needed feeding, and the empty pan that came back was the only compliment anyone required. If you still have her recipe box, what is the most stained card inside it? The paprikash? The Sunday roast? The meatloaf only she could make smell that way? Open the box this week and cook the card with the deepest fingerprints. Take a picture and drop the name in the comments. Tell us where she lived and what church she went to, because the recipe was never the heirloom. The hand that wrote it was.